Moyo, the Director of PRIZ, Public Policy Research Institute of Zimbabwe, to give us the opening remarks for this meeting and to speak to us on behalf of the organizers. Dr. Moyo. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. Can you confirm to me that you can hear me? Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, our fellow panelists, our guests, our collaborating organizations, Wild, PRIZ, and SIDE, our participants, those that are following us on social media, we welcome you to this very important conversation on the Constitution of the Republic of Zimbabwe. We want to put on the table to our colleagues who are going to present to us the key issues that underpin this meeting. We have had a number of meetings discussing the Constitution. A number of forums, platforms have unpacked and debunked this amendment. But today, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, we want to raise the bar and begin to do the toothpicking, crossing of T's and dotting of I's on the issue of motives. What lies behind the constitutional amendment number 2? Who are the drivers? Are the people of Zimbabwe drivers when they adopted the constitution only 6 years ago? And it hasn't been fully implemented, and some of the laws, the majority of the laws, have not been aligned. But already we are seeing the amendment. So who are these drivers? Are the people of Zimbabwe driving this process? Is it a sectional interest that is driving the process? These are the questions that we are putting on the table for debate this afternoon. We all know, you and I will agree, that the Constitution is a social glue, is an economic glue, it is a political glue, it is a cultural glue, it is a glue that binds the entire population of Zimbabwe, because when it was adopted 6-7 years ago, the majority of Zimbabweans record over 90% of Zimbabweans who voted gave it a seal of approval. And today it is being changed. Who are the beneficiaries? Who are the winners? Are Zimbabweans the winners? Who are the losers? Are Zimbabweans the losers? These are the questions that we are putting on the table. We want to unpack them and say, was yesterday a sad day when it was finally approved by both houses? Now that it has gone through all the processes, has it been a black day, a dark day, a sad day? Let's unpack this. What can we do going forward? Yes, we do the analysis. What can we do in going forward to ensure that democratic governance in this country is respected? These are the questions that are before us. As the organizers, the 3 organizations that came together and collaborated and they brought us all together here, you have put together a team of Zimbabweans who are professionals, who will speak to us not on party lines, not on sectional lines, but on Zimbabwe line. And these are the men and women who have spent time in understanding the legal landscape of our country, the constitutional landscape of our country. They mean well for our country. They are looking for the next generations to benefit from their ideas. And that is why we have this team. I therefore officially declare this meeting opened. Madam Chair, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Moyo, and thank you for laying the foundation for our engagement today. Who are the beneficiaries? Who are the drivers? What are the motives that are also driving them as they drive this process? 94.5% of Zimbabweans agreed to this constitution to be the glue that binds us. And when it is being amended, where are the 94.5% of the Zimbabweans? And what are they saying about this process? The Constitution is our social contract. And as it is being amended, where are the contractors? And who is amending for whose benefit? So today, this is what we seek to discuss. And to kick us off, I would like to invite Brian Kagoro. I've introduced him before. Brian Kagoro is a constitutional lawyer. He's going to give us his perspective of what he believes is happening and help us to unpack and understand in greater detail what this constitutional amendment is. Welcome, Brian. Over to you. Sorry, you are muted, Brian. Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry, I was saying thank you, Belinda. Allow me to thank Wild, Sight, and Pries for this kind invitation to an intimidating panel and even more intimidating set of participants. I was just looking at the names. Let me from the onset indicate that what we have going on, what we should be engaged in, is a much larger discussion about the history of colonial approaches to law, and therefore the need to decolonize our legal system and our approach to constitutionalism. We inherited a system that treats law as a system of subordination, of discipline, and of punishment that's wielded by those who are in authority or a set of elites. And so law as command of a political superior to a political inferior, as the old colonials used to believe. In this thinking, and I am, like in any dissertation, starting with the abstract, in this thinking, law and order to subordinate freedom and rights, which freedom and rights are seen as anarchy, lawlessness, disorderly or riotous. So in essence, the driving force is the establishment of control, of supervision, of surveillance. And in reality, therefore, since society is uncontrollable and unpredictable, and since we live in the age of uncertainty, this association of law and order, or security and obedience to the status quo, inevitably explains the violence that is invoked by some of the laws that are passed and approaches to enforcement of the law. So citizenship, in my view, and this is the central issue for all the debates we're going to have today, is accepting justice, but not subordination or silencing through law. And therefore, disorder in Zimbabwe reflects more the nature of the state, the Zimbabwean state, and the purpose to which the state has been put. And the amendments we're going to discuss are about the repurposing of the Zimbabwean state in order to serve particular interests. Now, it seems to me, if you accept that, this fundamentally is a conversation about rights struggles, a class struggle, and a generational struggle. and how the law, as currently proposed, either enables, undermines, or invokes that rights, class, and generational struggle. I want to suggest from the onset, colleagues, that the Constitution cannot carry the triple burden that is required to transform Zimbabwe. Economic structural transformation in order to create a more egalitarian or equal society, social transformation that should build us or take us to greater social cohesion and nation building, political transformation that would lead us to greater unity, tolerance, diversity, and etc., and state capacity that deals with questions of efficiency and effectiveness in public service delivery. A constitution at the very most is an aspirational document. It captures our aspirations. Number two, it's a power map. It defines who has power and how such power may be exercised in order to achieve the aspirations that are expressed in it. But a constitution is also a codification of contradiction. In the one hand, it allows tradition and culture to be recognized. And by the same breath, it allows, it talks about the liberation of women when some of the traditions and cultures may not necessarily be totally consistent with the liberation of women. It protects private property and also grants people the right to distribution and equitable distribution of resources. And because of that, we're still tragically being governed on the basis of yesterday's logic. I want to suggest, therefore, that this amendment number 2 is, number one, a failure of imagination, national consciousness, and leadership that seeks to blot a bureaucracy and to politicize the grassroots by undermining traditional democratic forms, because almost every sphere of life, and I will demonstrate from central government to local government to how you organize at the local level, has now been put within the firm control of a commandist structure. And I'll explain what I mean. This will choke relatively independent legal institutions that are supposed to exist to check the power of the executive and the diktat of the executive, irrational actions by the executive. So unlike the Mugabe era, where you had the same phenomenon and an overly charismatic character, and people were caught between embracing the charisma of Mugabe and denouncing the authoritarianism that we're seeing in commandist approaches to economy, to society, to politics. We neither have the charisma of leadership, the legitimacy, nor the intention to be sufficiently inclusive. But this, in essence, is the ghost of both the history of Rhodesia and the so-called First Republic. Some have suggested the ghost is manifest in the attempt to do coup-proofing by dealing with the role of the vice presidency, changing what was in the existing 2013 constitution. But there is a competition for those who are interested in the political science constitutional law binary. Number one, this bureaucracy is substituting independent bottom-up social development, independent bottom-up national development. And that bureaucracy, although necessary for the management of affairs, it is controlled by a political class and sometimes to the detriment of the citizens. And we know from our history that what has tended to happen is that a bureaucracy, whether lean or bloated, such as the one that's suggested, normally controls and exercises authority to the exclusion of certain political interests, certain demographic interests, and certain gender interests. And we could go into underdevelopment of particular regions in the country, the eastern part of the country, because of the feud that Mugabe had with Ndavaningi Stole, Matabeleland, the Midlands, and the list is endless. Number three, this amendment is about pouring new wine into old wineskins. There is an aspiration at the core of this amendment to create a cohesive state that can be marshaled in military terms in order to achieve a developmentalist agenda. But this is happening in a context of forced political and economic underdevelopment and social exclusion. So you are enlarging the political mass, but you have a diminished national consent and consensus to achieve a developmental state. So we are adopting a Chinese model of developmentalism marshaled from above, but we lack the cohesiveness and coherence that is required at the bottom to ensure that everybody feels they can hold the lowest level of the party, the lowest level of government to account. So in essence, by pouring this new wine into old wineskins, we will give rise to repetitive cycles of state authoritarianism. Concurrently, this will lead to a little bit more violence as citizens express and revolt against this sort of thing. But I want to warn us that the Zimbabwean state cannot fund the proposed bureaucracy. We are failing to pay the civil service as it is. We are failing to pay our way, and we are proposing enlarging the numbers of people that will rely on this largesse from the state. In essence, what we are seeing is an ambition that is not financed by local industrialization or local developmental, economic developmental capacity. More government and not more service delivery. More government and not more capacity. More supervision and surveillance and control, and not necessarily more transformation that unleashes the entrepreneurial capacities of Zimbabweans. It therefore means, my friends, that what we are seeing is wittingly or unwittingly an effective consolidation of power and an effective capture and repurposing of the state. Some have even suggested a recreation of an imperial presidency and an institutionalization of command economics, command politics, command agriculture, and etc. This is a poison chalice. It's a poison chalice in the context of the factions, the factionalism we have seen in political parties. Because as they compete to conquer this, we will have fundamental problems. So what is under test, Zimbabweans, is the nature of legal rule in post-independence Zimbabwe and the social, political, and economic context within which rule of law and the misimagination of liberation are occurring. Liberation without political freedoms. Liberation without economic emancipation, at least for the majority. Liberation without the conditions that create equality and equity for workers, for women, and for young people. Now, constitutionality and rule of law can serve to mediate tensions or relations of power in society. Relations of power within a ruling class, relations of power between groups, classes, genders, and elites. What this particular amendment number 2 does, it balances various interests within and amongst the current elites without taking cognizance of the interest of those elites who are not in that inner circle. And what this portends to is disaster. And I will explain. And then, of course, you have these constitutional and legal forms that are being imposed by an elite. Brute power, cooperative power, which is not transformative. So this is a power grab. But why is this power grab important? It is important for those of you who study economics, because in order to transact the sort of policies that Minister Mthuli Ncube and others have brought, the austerity measures, narrow neoliberal policies, you actually require a more authoritarian state than a more libertarian state. And this will polarize not just the elites, but it will polarize classes. Because you will note from the effect nature, whether it's consolidation of the public service, from civil service to public service, and I'll explain this, or it's what you're seeing with local government and the creation of new provincial and other structures, that what you are essentially doing is creating a command and control structure that essentially undermines the very essence of elite parties and cohesion, never mind the popular classes. So the legal regime will become an enemy to itself. There is a writer called Kagaditsky who says this is market Stalinism, right? So it's increased economic oppression, reinforced by severely limited civic and political space. That's what these amendments are supposed to achieve. Diminished legal or human rights freedoms, but increase the ability of the state elite to sign contracts with international organizations and investors and bilaterals without being subjected to the control of parliament or the scrutiny of parliament. Should we lose hope? No. So in reality, what we are looking at is the limiting of social, economic, political freedoms and the increase in state authoritarianism. Let me explain, lest people that say we engaged in rhetorics. Chapter 10 of the 2013 Constitution establishes the civil service for Zimbabwe. And it talks about a single civil service responsible for the administration of Zimbabwe. And by implication, as Dr. Magaisa will tell you, this is in section 199. It is an independent, supposedly independent and non-partisan civil service. The new amendment now constitutes what is called a public service, a single public service, but whose job is to implement the policies of the executive branch of government and to assist in administering Zimbabwe and to deliver service. Now, this is not a small nuance. This is a fundamental shift and repurposing of your public service. In fact, I know people have been worried about the vice president and other things. This particular amendment on the civil service is one that must worry you significantly. To get a birth certificate, you need the civil service. School, civil service, a public service. Education, public service. Almost everything that citizens require for their daily subsistence, for their daily lives, whether it's licensing, comes through the public service. And the suggestion that the sole purpose of that singular united public administration is to simply implement the policies of the executive branch of government sounds benign. Who else makes policies? But remember, the reference to executive branch means that the public service is not paying attention to the policies as they emerge from the judicial branch, policies as they emerge from the legislative branch. And often we know when you have an independent parliament, sometimes the independent parliament passes laws that the executives are not happy with. And the public service in our constitution in sections 200 is supposed to act lawfully according to the constitution, must not obey any unlawful or illegal, manifestly illegal order. They must act fairly in a non-partisan manner. They must further the interest of, they must not further the interest of any political party. They must not prejudice the lawful interest of any political party or cause. They must not violate fundamental rights and freedoms. They must not be office bearers of any political party. Now, with the changes, if now the civil service, instead of being under the chairperson of the Civil Service Commission, now will be under the chief secretary to the president and cabinet. It is through him that they will report. Herein lies a repurposing of the entire Zimbabwean public service. I think this should exercise young people and old people more than anything else we have discussed. Partly when you look at the powers and qualifications of the chief secretary to the president and cabinet, and you juxtapose them with the qualifications that were required of the head of civil service before. And when you look at the dynamic of relationship between the chief secretary to the president and cabinet, and the relationship to the president as a political player, and the president and the political party interests, it is useful for us to say that left in the hands of angels, this clause would not worry us. But because we're governed by human beings, it is important that we look at this carefully. I will not delve into the discussion of quota. I will not delve into the discussion of 10 youth representatives and the women selected on the basis of the party system. Let me just say this. It seems commendable on the face of it to say you are moving from 5 to 7 potentially appointable non-parliament, non-MP members of the cabinet. But remember the relationship between the cabinet and the public service that I've just referred to. Let's assume that we stick to current figures and the cabinet is not to exceed 24. And you can appoint willy-nilly 7 of them. Plus you appoint 2 vice presidents. That means the number of appointees will almost be 50% of the executive. This would really not be an issue, except when you look at the broader provisions on the executive's accountability to parliament and the daily mandate of executives. Let me explain. We have the Minister of Mines, who's responsible for signing away our mineral resources or protecting them. We have the Minister of Infrastructure, who's responsible for roads and infrastructure. Minister of Energy, who's responsible for energy. Minister of Tourism, who's responsible for all our wildlife and so on and so forth. Let's assume that all these are appointed, have the sort of control that we have just read with respect to the public service, and are also not accountable to parliament, because another part of the amendment says that we no longer require the executive to subordinate itself to parliamentary approval when it enters into agreements with international organizations and expanded interpretation. So what area of oversight remains within the remit of the legislature? Of what use would separation of powers serve if on the most fundamental issues relating to investment in our country and development, the legislature will have no oversight role? Matters relating to procurement of debt, they will have no control. It seems to me, sorry, was that someone saying something?
Sorry, Brian, 2 minutes?
No, that's fine. So I wanted to say, I have heard all the arguments. What I want to fundamentally say is under threat, other than things I've said, is separation of powers. And the very essence of a constitutional democracy is accountability of the executive. What we now have is the executive subordinating all other arms of government to be accountable to it. For young people, it is not enough to have one person elected on a political party list system, purportedly from each province, which is 10 people, to qualify for inclusion of young people. Remember, someone said it was school proofing. I want to suggest that this is a response to calls that were internal to a political party about non-inclusion of young people. But is this effective inclusion of young people and women? No, it is not, for 2 reasons. If young people between the ages of 15, or let's say to about 35, constitute almost 75% of the population, how do you explain that old people who between the ages of 64 and 100 are only 4% of the population are saying to young people, we'll give you out of 210 10 slots, and you, the majority, must be comfortable with it? Young people, vechidiki, changamkai, vugani. This is not about you. This is about how to keep the eldership in leadership and how to grant a few young people opportunities that are meaningless, because there's not been a guarantee that 50% or 30% of the cabinet positions will go to young people or to women. Therefore, it's a quota system which is to count you without including you in fundamental influence and decision making. I want to suggest that this amendment must be opposed, not purely for its content, but for its intention and impact. Its impact is to take the country back to the Stone Age, where the control of both the state, the economy, and society vests in the hands of a bureaucracy, which itself has been substituted by a small political elite in whoever governs our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for that elaborate or eye-opening presentation, speaking to us about how this constitution represents our aspirations. Yet at this point, it is full of contradictions, wherein lies so many motives and many people on the driving seat, and we don't know where this bus is going. And yet we are promised that as young people in the bus, we can sit on the front seat, maybe the first 4 rows are reserved for us, and the whole bus then belongs to the eldership who are in leadership. Thank you for that, Brian. I will ask at this I will ask that we can use the chat for our contributions. We will get an opportunity to engage with the presenters, but for the purpose of the floor, I will ask Paul to come after Brian, and Ken will have a plenary, and then we'll have the other speakers come thereafter. So may we write our contributions on the chat so that we don't lose sight of them. And when we have the plenary, we'll bring them up. Thank you so much. Siposami Malunga is the Executive Director of the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. And I would like to welcome him to give us his take on the issue today, unpacking the real motives, the real drivers, and the real winners and losers and beneficiaries of the Constitutional Amendment number 2. Thank you, Sipo. You're welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much, Belinda, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Brian, and my fellow panelists. I'm going to read something because sometimes we talk about things and we don't read these things as often. We, the people of Zimbabwe, united in our diversity by our common desire for freedom, justice, and equality, and our heroic resistance to colonialism, racism, and all forms of domination and oppression, exalting and extolling the brave men and women who sacrificed their lives during the Chimurenga, Umvukela, and national liberation struggles, honoring our forebears and compatriots who toiled for the progress of our country, recognizing the need to entrench democracy, good, transparent, and accountable governance, and the rule of law, reaffirming our commitment to upholding and defending fundamental human rights and freedoms, acknowledging the richness of our natural resources, celebrating the vibrancy of our traditions and cultures, determined to overcome all challenges and obstacles that impede our progress, cherishing freedom, equality, peace, justice, tolerance, prosperity, and patriotism in search of new frontiers under a common destiny, acknowledging the supremacy of Almighty God in whose hands our future lies. Resolve by the tenets of this Constitution to commit ourselves to build a united, just, and prosperous nation founded on values of transparency, equality, freedom, fairness, honesty, and the dignity of hard work, and imploring the guidance and support of Almighty God, hereby make this Constitution and commit ourselves to it as the fundamental law of our beloved land. That is the preamble of our Constitution. I do not even see the necessity. I know that my brother Brian has covered the details. I do not see the necessity of explaining why these amendments are the most treasonous things anybody in our country can ever do. They go against our desire, our commitment, our spirit and aspirations as the people. The only people that are above the constitution in any country, are the people themselves. The constitution of any country is the document of the people. The people are more powerful than the constitution. What has happened here is that a few individuals have decided to change this supreme sacred text, which we, the people, decided on. And the preamble clearly says what the aspirations are. What these people have done is unconstitutional, it is illegal, it is sacrilegious, it is treasonous. That is why I have been saying in the past few weeks that firstly, the Constitutional Court should not have given Parliament the right and the Senate the right to do what it did. It was wrong for the Constitutional Court to do that. It was illegal and it was unconstitutional. So the Constitutional Court acted unconstitutionally. Senate acted unconstitutionally. Parliament acted unconstitutionally. And the president, in signing this, is about to act unconstitutionally. And each and every unconstitutional act is impeachable, from Parliament to Senate to the president himself. Up until now, he is not yet an accomplice because he has not yet signed it. But we all know that all this is for him. Parliament didn't wake up one day and decide, let's do this. Even under Mugabe, we never had this. And I want to say something else. It doesn't end here. I'm not going to speak for too long because I know that we have constitutional lawyers and experts coming after me. I'm just going to use my time very briefly and remind all these people that are doing all these things. The Algerian Revolution, 2010, 2012, it was a people's revolution, it was an uprising. It was triggered by corruption and authoritarianism. The Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan resulted in the removal of Akayev, President Akayev, triggered in 2005. It was triggered by corruption and authoritarianism. The Egyptian Revolution was triggered by authoritarianism and corruption, 2011. It resulted in Mubarak being removed by the people. The Egyptian Revolution, the Jordanian Revolution of 2011 and 2012, triggered by authoritarianism and corruption. The Moroccan Revolution, 2011-2012, triggered by authoritarianism and corruption. The Syrian uprising and the civil war that continues up to today, that has destroyed Syria into a pile of rubble, and they have no way out, triggered by corruption and authoritarianism. The Tunisian Revolution of 2010, which resulted in Ali Ben Ali running away and ushering in democracy, triggered by authoritarianism and corruption. The Yemeni Revolution that has reduced Yemen to a pile of rubble, and the conflict is still continuing, triggered by corruption and authoritarianism. The Egyptian Revolution, more recently, triggered by corruption and authoritarianism. The Burkina Revolution that resulted in Blaise Compaoré running away, triggered by an attempt to change the constitution, authoritarianism and corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sipho, for that challenge to us. It is up to us, those with ears have heard, that the treasonous act of amending the people's constitution without the people approving cannot continue unchallenged. So in our conversations, let's continue to ask ourselves, what is it that we can do beyond this platform to reclaim our position as the citizens? The Constitution is clear that the right to govern is derived from the people, the governed, and it is up to us, the governed, the citizens, to do something to protect the sacred contract between us and the governors. Thank you, Sipho. Straight to the point. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to invite those who would like to interact with our presenters just briefly in a plenary, and then we'll have more presentations thereafter. You can show by raising your hand or writing on the chat. I do not yet see hands, so I will read from the chats. Okay, Doug Coltert. Yes, Doug, you can go ahead and ask. Sorry, Doug, you are muted. Sorry.
Sorry. Yes, I'm there now. I put my question in the chat, but maybe for the benefit of everyone, I had asked Brian, in light of what he said, that these amendments go directly to the heart of separation of powers, which is, one of the most fundamental doctrines of constitutionalism. I'd asked him what the prospects are of using the doctrine of the basic structure doctrine, the basic structure to challenge the amendments. The basic structure doctrine is basically a legal doctrine which has been adopted in some other jurisdictions, such as India, where amendments to the constitution, if they attack the very heart of how the constitutional order is set up, that they can be ruled unconstitutional by the court. So that was the essence of my question to Brian, it would be good to hear your thoughts on that, Brian.
Thank you, Doug. Any more hands before I ask Brian to respond? Brian, what can be done to reverse the unconstitutional amendments? This is from Wellington. And then another question. These are the questions we have so far. We have Brian articulating the beneficiaries being the political elites, their international handlers, and the securocrats, and that this is a repurposing of the state at all levels, local, provincial, national, and also in its international relations. If there are no more questions, we will have more plenary later. I will ask Brian to respond to the two questions, the question from Doug and the question from Wellington. Brian, please. Thank you.
Wellington. Let me start with the easy one. Doug, it would be an exciting prospect to actually...
Brian, you're very faint.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
We can kind of hear you, but you're still quite faint, Brian.
Oh, that's so strange. I don't know how this... Is there an improvement?
I think you can go ahead. We'll just have to listen closely.
Okay, let me pull closer to the device. I was saying it's an interesting prospect. There are judicial remedies to this, but that carry little prospect because the amendment itself promises, it's like a Christmas gift for some of the judicial officers, extending retirement age, permitting for the annual, if you like, renewal at the pleasure of the president of superior judges' tenure. Whatever happened to, of course, there has to be consultation with Judicial Service Commission, but that very fact seems problematic because if one renews that and does so at the pleasure of another arm of government, it's problematic. And I think Dr. Magaisa, I don't want to steal his thunder, is going to go a little bit more into the repurposing of the prosecution, the repurposing of the judiciary, and also the dilution of the Human Rights Commission instead of enhancement of its mandate by the creation of a public protector whose mandate seems unclear, right? What remedies for issues that otherwise would not be justiciable or actionable in courts. I mean, it's a meaningless bit, but Dr. Magaisa perhaps will explain that later on. I want to suggest that whilst the judicial remedies are good for us to say we tested the legal niceties, the most fundamental challenge that we face is political. when the state is being reconstituted in such a brazen manner, it means that the political elite or those in control of the state have reached a level of comfort that there would not be any protest, there would not be any resistance, there would not be any questioning from any quarter. That therefore the only thing that faces them is consolidating power and a long-term project of succession amongst themselves. So in essence, we are seeing not only arrogance, but we are seeing assuredness in the ruling class, that there is no force that currently exists in the country capable of tipping the balance of power. The struggle here is that this is not just about power. This is also about welfare. This is also about management of the economy. It is also management of the public sector. That's why I highlighted the public, that a unitary public service ordinarily would be a good thing. But the nuance, when you look at the whole ecosystem of checks and balances and control, you realize that an armed robbery has been transacted, and it's being done with the acquiescence of people. That's what I would urge, is a political solution by social actors, political actors, to the challenge that we face. And that political solution requires that people be organized beyond political parties and also be organized beyond narrow sectarian interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for elaborating on what we need to do. Let us be thinking about how beyond this meeting, people can be organized beyond these cleavages that we find ourselves in, beyond the political affiliations and inclinations and persuasions that people have, and the potential benefits that they may get from this particular amendment for the sake of the country and for the sake of the constitution, and indeed for the sake of the citizens. And thank you also for highlighting the issue on the judiciary. There is a comment that the remedies that we seek are judiciary. What are the prospects of success when some members of the judiciary are compromised? I think that's what you also spoke to, that the remedy within the judiciary is limited by that they are also being offered this Christmas present in May. So that remedy may not work well for us. Hence, the more political solution by social actors, as you clearly articulated. Thank you for that. And Sipho, would you like to come in, or you'll come in later? There was no question directed at you, but maybe there may be something that you want to speak to before I invite Julian Mukova to come in with a presentation.
If there was no question directed at me, I don't think I can come in. Thank you so much, Belinda. And I think Brian has covered it in any case.
Thank you, Sipho. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome Julian Mukova, a legal practitioner, to share with us on her perspective of who the real winners and the losers are, and what are the motives that are driving this constitutional amendment. Julian, welcome. I can see. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Belinda. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you to Brian and Siposami that have gone before me. You've given us some wonderful insights and a lot of food for thought. I'm going to talk this afternoon about the implications of the Constitution Amendment number 2 on judicial independence and the separation of powers. So in my view, to understand the implications of the Constitution Amendment number 2 on judicial independence and the separation of powers, one has to understand the history and the evolution of Section 180 and Section 186 of the Constitution And this is in light of Section 189, Section 190, and Section 328, subsection 7 of the Constitution. So in brief, if we look at our history, COPAC issued 3 draft constitutions, that is before the 2013 Constitution, which we commonly term our new Constitution. It's not so new anymore. But in the December 2011 edition, there was an entity that was termed the Parliamentary Public Appointments Committee, which was vested with a critical role in appointing persons to key positions such as the judiciary. This role was subsequently removed from the July 2012 draft constitution, as well as the final draft constitution, in which the president then appoints the judges at the recommendation of the Judicial Service Commission only. So whilst this is a welcome development from the previous era in which the president had wide powers of appointing the judiciary, it was not without its downside. The removal of the Parliamentary Public Appointments Committee effectively had the effect of narrowing the gap between the judiciary and the executive insofar as the principle of separation of powers was concerned. And I know to some extent, Brian spoke about the issue of separation of powers, which I will also touch on in this presentation. So now, if we look at the evolution of Section 180 of the Constitution, which deals with the appointment of judges, we will find that in its original form, Section 180 of the Constitution had the import that the president appoints a judge, and mark these words because they're very critical and how they're differentiated in the evolution of that particular section of the Constitution. The president would appoint a judge on the recommendation, and I'll place emphasis on the recommendation of the Judicial Service Commission. This is following advertising, nominations, public interviews, subsequent to which a list of 3 nominees would be submitted to the president, who will then make an appointment. And in this case, in terms of Section 180 of the Constitution as it stood in 2013, was that all judges were to be subject to this procedure of appointment. Now, Constitution, fast track 4 years later, the Constitution Amendment number 1 of 2017 came into being. Although parts of the original Section 180 were retained insofar as the appointment of judges was concerned, the section was substituted with a new clause which separated the appointment of the 3 topmost judicial positions from the rest of the judges. So the focus of the first 3 subsections of Section 180 of the Constitution, as amended by Amendment number 1, was dedicated to the appointment of the Chief Justice, the Deputy Chief Justice, and the Judge President of the High Court. So those 3 topmost positions were now separated in how they would be appointed. And effectively what the import is that the president then appoints the Chief Justice, the Deputy Chief Justice, and the Judge President of the High Court, and mark this, after consultation with the JSC. So if you look at the original form, the president would appoint a judge on recommendation of the JSC, which means that the JSC is involved. And the person that will be appointed comes from a recommendation which is made by the JSC. But if you look at Constitution Amendment number 1, the president will make the appointment after consultation. So after consultation effectively means he will consult the JSC. Depending on whether he takes it or leaves it, he will then make his appointment subsequently of the Chief Justice, the Deputy Chief Justice, and the Judge President of the High Court. So I will read how it is worded in Constitution Amendment number 1, because I think it's very important for us to know what it says, particularly the proviso. It says, if the appointment of a Chief Justice, Deputy Chief Justice, or Judge President of the High Court is not consistent with any recommendation made by the Judicial Service Commission in terms of subsection 2, the president shall cause Senate to be informed as soon as is practicable, provided that for the avoidance of doubt, it is declared that the decision of the president as to such appointment shall be final. So the involvement of Senate, the involvement of whoever else is just for information purposes. And whatever decision that the president then makes becomes final in terms of what Constitution Amendment number 1 said. So it's also Constitution Amendment number 1 in terms of section 180 also had the added appointment of the senior judge of the labor court and the administrative court, who are also appointed by the Chief Justice, and hear this, after consultation with the Judicial Service Commission. Fast track, 4 years later, after the first amendment, we are now sitting at Constitution Amendment number 2, which allows the president to promote a Supreme Court or High Court judge on recommendation of the Judicial Service Commission to a higher court. And this is without having to submit to the procedure of advertising, nominations, and public interviews. I will also want to read the wording of subsection 4, the proposed subsection 4 and 4A, because it's critical in how it's worded. The devil is always in the writing. So subsection A says, subject to section 4A, whenever it is necessary to appoint a judge other than the Chief Justice, Deputy Chief Justice, Judge President of the High Court, or a sitting High Court judge. And then subsection 4A says, notwithstanding subsection 4. So that means, never mind what, despite what subsection 4 says, the president, acting on the recommendation of the Judicial Service Commission, and it says on the recommendation of the Judicial Service Commission, may appoint a sitting judge of the Supreme Court or High Court to be a judge of a higher court whenever a vacancy arises in such a court. So at the end of the day, all the power rests with the president in terms of appointing as well as promoting sitting judges. So now one will ask themselves, who really is the JSC? And it's important for us to interrogate this. If you look at section 189 of the Constitution, the Judicial Service Commission comprises of the Chief Justice, the Deputy Chief Justice, the Judge President of the High Court, a judge, the Attorney General, and the Chief Magistrate, amongst other people. But the top 3 most judicial persons comprise of the JSC. Section 190 of the Constitution then tells us that the JSC, as part of its functions, may tender advice to the government on any other matter relating to the judiciary or the administration of justice, and the government must pay regards to any such advice. So it tenders advice. The question is, who is the government and who heads the government? The person who has appointed the 3 topmost judicial persons in Zimbabwe is the one who is going to be given advice under the JSC. We need to think about it. So we'll go on to interrogate section 186 of the Constitution, which deals with the tenure of judges. So in the Constitution of 2013, all judges must retire at midnight on their 70th birthday. Fast track to Constitution Amendment number 1. It didn't tamper with this particular section. But interestingly, in Constitution Amendment number 2, it repeals the entire section and substitutes it with a new one, which has the effect of permitting the judges of the Constitutional Court to continue in office for a further period of up to 5 years at the judge's election and subject to the approval of the president on an annual basis from the year that they turn 70. And mark this. This is after consultation with the JSC. So once again, there's consultation with the JSC, but whether the JSC approves or not, the president will still make the decision on whether or not to extend on an annual basis up to 5 years. So effectively, that has the effect of extending retirement up to 75 and not 70 as intended by the Constitution of 2013. And I believe the drafters of the Constitution of 2013 had a reason why the retirement age was at 70 and not 75. But now, for the convenience of sorts, it seems that those topmost judges in the Constitutional Court will then be allowed to retire at 75 at the pleasure of the president, just as indicated earlier on by Brian. So if you look at that particular section 186, I would encourage you to read it in light of section 328, subsection 7 of the Constitution. And this is what it says. Notwithstanding any other provision of this section, an amendment to term limit provision, the effect of which is to extend the length of time that a person may hold or occupy any public office, does not apply in relation to any person who held or occupied that office or an equivalent office at any time before the amendment. So now the question is, how then does that reconcile with the extension of the tenure of judges in Constitution Amendment number 2? I would submit that it simply doesn't, emphatically at that. So coming back to the essence of my presentation today, what then are the implications of Constitution Amendment number 2 on judicial independence and the separation of powers? There are 4 quick points. The first one, it reverts to the situation as it stood prior to the 2013 Constitution. So effectively, in terms of the 2013 Constitution, we took 10 steps forward, but 25 steps back. So we go back to the situation pre-2013, which is regressive, in my humble opinion. The second implication is that the president now has widened powers, would now have widened powers to appoint and retain in office the top 3 judicial officers, thereby giving the perception, and this word is important, perception, that he may be in control of the judiciary. We know the saying that justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done. So if there is that perception that he is in control of the judiciary, is justice being seen to be done? I don't think so. The third aspect is that there's very little separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary. Even the aspect of checks and balances between the 2 arms of the state are seemingly compromised. And the last implication is that it may lead to a non-independent judiciary, which in turn erodes the principle of the rule of law and human rights in Zimbabwe. And an independent judiciary, I would say, is the key to the rule of law being upheld, together with the preservation of human rights. So as my parting shot, I will say it may be another 4 years that the Constitution will again be amended to reconsider the regressive implications of the Constitution Amendment number 2 on judicial independence and the separation of powers, unless this is challenged by the people of Zimbabwe through the law, which I would totally advocate for, to ensure that we have adequate separation of powers and to ensure that we have an independent judiciary, because that is critical to the democratic fabric of the country of Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian, for that clearly articulated presentation that helps us to appreciate the issues around the judiciary independence. You speak to the implications that the perception that justice is being done or seems to be done is also being undermined, that the issue of the separation of powers is also being compromised as the gap between the judiciary and the executive is being narrowed. You also speak to the threat of the non-independence of the judiciary. And you took us through an understanding of who constitutes the JSC. And now we are more enlightened why the JSC will make certain recommendations But I have a question. Well, I'm hoping I'm wrong. I heard a rumor that someone is turning 70 this year. So this amendment does not apply to them. They will have to resign first and be reconsidered later, or it has nothing to do with them. This is just a mischievous contribution I am making right there. But thank you so much for taking us through that. There is a contribution from Brian. He spoke earlier before your presentation that it's not possible to judicially cure a structural or political problem. So as we continue with our engagement and discussion, let's look at the options, the political options, the judiciary options. What is it that Zimbabweans can do? And then there is a contribution that these amendments sailed through very easily. Even the feedback from the public consultations were completely ignored. What makes or made this easy for these people to do this? What can the people do to prevent more of this happening? The judiciary route is a non-starter. And then I add a question. You will not respond to this now, but we can note it. I add a question about who the members of parliament represent. If all the people that braved the cold during that week of the outreach and braved the risk of COVID-19 and attended the public meetings, the public hearings, and expressed their displeasure at the amendment, and a report to that effect is there, but then there is a continuation by the MPs to amend the constitution despite the people objecting to it. Then who do the MPs really serve? Whom do they represent? Are they servants of the people? So these are questions that we think of as we continue. At this point, allow me to invite Nigiwe Ncube Chabalala to give us her take on the topic of the day. Welcome, Nigiwe. Please, let's keep the questions coming in. Welcome, Nigiwe. If possible, may you please put on your camera so that we can see you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. I will not take much of your time because we are talking of a topic that is very sensitive and so disheartening to be happening in Zimbabwe in the midst of COVID. I thought we have enough stresses of our own as a nation. Unfortunately, now we have to talk about this topic. The implications of Amendment 2, as painful as they are very simple. It's undermining the will and the power of the citizens in making this constitution. So much effort was put, and over a short space of time, that is being taken away from us. There's the undermining of the supremacy of the constitution itself. Seposami read earlier on about the preamble on the constitution to say, we, the people of Zimbabwe, we have not complained about the provisions in the constitution. We are saying, what are the reasons? Are there good and sufficient reasons to amend the constitution? And the answer definitely is a big no. So at the end of the day, we are saying, where is the supremacy of the constitution if we're going to mutilate it the way it is being done? The manner in which it's being done is questionable. It takes away transparency. It takes away accountability. which principles are so important in making a constitution, which principles other nations are saying these are basic and standard. Go to South Africa, our neighbors, these principles are just standard. What is so unique of Zimbabwe to then take away this power from the people to make their own constitution and just amend it at whim without any cause, without anyone complaining? I'm so touched by the way we are taking away the running mate clause. We haven't even tried it out. We haven't even practiced or felt how it's like to actually vote for our leaders into power. What has gone wrong, really? All the principles that are supposed to be upheld in making a constitution just thrown under the bus, just like that. I think it really is such a bad precedent that we are setting as a nation. A precedent to just do things at whim to satisfy the few, while it's ignoring the masses that spent so much time. You know, it was such a victory. I remember in 2013, it was such a victory to come up with this constitution and to say, now we are heading for democracy. And instead of aligning all the other laws to the constitution, here we are going back, as the other speaker said, we are like working 20 steps forward and 31 steps backwards. And the question is, why? Why Zimbabwe? Talk about adding on more women into parliament and the youth. To me, that's not even a reasonable reason to have this constitution amendment, because this is not a game of numbers of how many people do we have in parliament. It's about the effectiveness and the efficiency that they bring on board. What we should actually be advocating more of is the quality that of the candidates that we have in there, as compared to the game of numbers that is supposedly answering into women representation and youth representation. The odds are too many against the constitution. I will not take much of the time because my other fellow colleagues have already done justice to the implications of amendment number 2. My encouragement to Zimbabwe is the old man that prophesied that you and I have work to do. I think he was in the right direction. We have work to do. We need to engage the state and re-engage. The process has already started. I have seen applications in the courts where the very illegality of this amendment is being challenged, to say the parliament was dissolved. We're not supposed to be talking about amendment number 2 anymore. We just hope justice will be done and not only seem to be done. We cannot debate much on that since it's pending before the courts, but I think it's also a step in the right direction in trying to clean up this mess. We encourage Zimbabweans, in as much as it's painful and it's challenging, let us continue to engage and re-engage with the state parties. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nigiwe, for sharing with us some of the perspectives from the citizens, that this is actually undermining the power of the citizens, undermining the supremacy of the Constitution, taking away transparency and accountability, and attacking the very principles that underpin the Constitution. And you speak to the issues of the legality of the amendment and why we are not focusing on alignment of the so many legislation that needs to be, pieces of legislation that need to be aligned to the Constitution, instead of attacking and tearing the Constitution before we've even implemented sections of it. Thank you for that. There are questions that have come up. This is to Brian and Julian. Going forward, how do we ensure adherence to the Constitution, that is term limits? We've been led by the elderly for the past 40 years. Any provision for age limits? And then another question, this one is to Julian. Thank you, Julian. I like the idea that there is still an opportunity for the people of Zimbabwe to challenge this amendment number 2. My question is, how can the people be assisted in challenging this? And then another question that is from our Facebook platform is, what did we do to enlighten earlier before the passage of the bill? I guess it's enlighten the people earlier before the passage of the bill, or it's enlightening the MPs, but what enlighten the people, citizens around this bill before it was passed? So we can continue contributing on the Facebook platform. We will read your questions to our guest speakers, and also let us make use of the chat function here to capture things as they come to our minds, and to also ask questions. Thank you, Nigiwe, for that. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, let me invite Dr. Alex Makaisa to share with us his perspective. And after that, we will have an engagement with the 3 speakers, but we'll also open it up to those who still want to ask Brian and Sipho questions, because we would have had all the speakers having given us their presentations. Let me invite Dr. Alex Makaisa. You're welcome. Please give us your contribution.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Now, I would like some confirmation, Belinda, that you can hear me, or from someone.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who has come to this platform. Thank you to Dr. Moyo and all the organizers of this platform. I think it's very important that we are having these discussions at this historic juncture in the life of our Constitution. I also want to acknowledge the wonderful presentations that have been given by fellow panelists, starting with Brian, who gave a very important, I would say, political context and philosophical context in which these amendments are taking place. I often say to my students that constitutional law is not just a matter of reading the rules as they are written in the text. You also have to have a very nuanced political understanding of what is going on, the role of political actors, and indeed also understanding things that are sometimes even unwritten. They are also part of the governance structure. When I was invited to this forum, I was advised that there were 3 important things we needed to discuss. Number 1, the motives. And number 2, the drivers. And number 3, the beneficiaries of these amendments. And I will try to speak to all 3 of them, taking into account, of course, that my colleagues have already so ably dissected a number of the issues. And in that regard, for some of them, I will just give you brief summarized views of what I had prepared. Essentially, I would like to invite you to consider that what is going on in Zimbabwe at the moment, and indeed this is the manner in which I characterize the implications and the impact of the 2 amendments that have been passed by Parliament in the last month. And it is that there is now a potential for a constitutional crisis. And I want you to mark that word to understand what a constitutional crisis is, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with that terminology. A constitutional crisis is something that happens where there is a major political misunderstanding, a major political dispute, which cannot clearly be resolved on the basis of the existing constitution or by established practice. Now, it is of course a rather ill-defined term which attracts a number of definitions. But I would suggest, as a matter of context, a number of examples that have been given by academics, by practitioners of constitutional law. Sometimes a constitutional crisis occurs when the constitution itself does not provide a structure to be able to resolve a political dispute. A particular dispute that we had not very long ago, in November 2017, that was a dispute between the members of the executive, the president in particular, and the military. And that dispute had to be resolved through the use of force. And eventually it was resolved by President Mugabe being forced to resign in terms of that constitution. But we were, for that particular point, a situation in which we were going through a constitutional crisis. And that constitutional crisis, unfortunately, was not entirely resolved by what happened, and indeed was not completely resolved by the elections of 2018. And so that is an example of a constitutional crisis, when the constitution no longer operates to resolve a particular problem. Another type of constitutional crisis is when one arm of the state hijacks or takes over another. Now, you might make reference again to the coup in November 2017, but I would say, in light of the current amendments that we are looking at, you'll find that both constitutional amendment number 1 and number 2, they have one fundamental impact in the relations between the executive arm of our state and the judicial arm of our state. Brian, Sipho, and Julian, and also Nikiwe, they've all given an indication of what is happening to the judiciary. What these amendments are doing is they are essentially transferring power that had been given to other bodies, is being given to the president, enhancing the power of the president, and therefore allowing the president to handpick judges to the Supreme Court and to the Constitutional Court, and therefore allowing the president to have considerable amount of control in who sits on those benches of the higher courts of the land. This is giving a very bad picture, or a very compromised picture of the judiciary, where we are seeing a progressive, or you could even say maybe a better way, the retrogressive taking away of powers that are held by the judiciary and potentially compromising the judiciary. So one could say that we are in the throes of a constitutional crisis in which the executive is hijacking the judicial arm of the state. Another type of constitutional crisis is when the constitution is being changed in such a way that it no longer serves the basic values or the basic structure of the constitution, the fundamental values and principles of the constitution. I like that Doug Coulthard, he raised this issue when he was talking about the basic structure of the constitution, that sometimes there are amendments that take place which go so far into the core of the constitution that they disrupt the very structure, the very basic structure of the constitution, to the point that it no longer serves the basic values and principles that it is intended to serve. And in that regard, you will also have a constitutional crisis. And therefore, if you take the position that these amendments are going so far into the core of the constitution that they are impacting fundamentally the basic values and principles of our constitution, then you will come to the conclusion that we are in the throes of a constitutional crisis. The final example that I will give, and there are more examples, but we don't have a lot of time to go through all of them, is were what you may call constitutional infidelity. Now, one of the most important things that you find in a constitution is that it must be respected, it must be upheld, it must be defended, not only by the people, but more significantly by those who hold power. So the president, one of his fundamental duties is to protect and uphold the constitution. The judiciary also has the same duty. Parliament also has the same duty. When we were in the process of crafting the constitution, we also anticipated that you could not fully trust these actors to protect the constitution as they are required to do. And that's why we came up with section 328 of the constitution. Those of you who have read my latest article, The Big Saturday Read, which talks about section 328, you will understand what I'm on about here. But section 328 was designed in such a way that it is required not only to protect the constitution, but that it must also protect itself. Because section 328 says, whenever there is an amendment to the constitution, number one, there must be at least a 2/3 majority. Now, for most of the constitution, that is the requirement. But we anticipated that there were some core parts of the constitution that should not be changed just by parliamentarians alone. We wanted the power to be given to the people. And so, if you are going to amend chapter 4 of the Constitution, which is the Declaration of Rights of the Constitution, all our fundamental rights and freedoms, you would have to go to a referendum. I should also add that, at some point, and I like that Julian mentioned the different stages of the Constitution making process and the different drafts. And I apologize, I should be writing this story somewhere, but I will do so one day. We had actually included a clause in the Constitution which said that the Bill of Rights, no provision of the Bill of Rights can be amended unless it is adding to the rights that are already provided for. In other words, you cannot amend a provision of the Bill of Rights for the purpose of diminishing it or reducing the rights that are already provided for. Now, I left the constitution making process at another point when I was invited to join the trenches.
I beat the fuck out your bitch ass, nigga. I come from all that dumbass shit, nigga. What you saying, nigga? You named after an anime character, you gay ass faggot. You's a faggot. You celebrate gay pride. You dumbass nigga. I'll beat the fuck out your bitch ass. You don't have any ideas. I'll do it. They don't tell me like that. I'll be showing your grandma. Get the message, you faggot.
Listen, and please do not allow people without known names on. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I
sorry, Alex. You invoke that response.
No, I have encountered this before, so I kind of expected it. It's designed to disturb the flow. But anyway, the point I was on about was that we wanted to make a constitution which would ensure a stronger and better protection of what we had provided for. And at some point, I realized that this clause was no longer in the Constitution. I'm still looking for it and wondering what happened to it. But it was meant to enhance protection of the Constitution. Now, the point I was making is that when you have a Constitution that is no longer obeyed, when you have these key actors of the Constitution no longer obeying or upholding the Constitution, then you have a constitutional crisis. I think it was my brother Siposade who mentioned that Constitutional Amendment number 1 is itself illegal because it is based on a bill that does not exist. The bill did not exist when Senate voted on it on April the 6th. The simple reason is that under our law, under the Constitution, Section 147, all bills lapse, they come to an end, they become invalid when Parliament is dissolved. Now, Constitutional Amendment number 1 was introduced under the last Parliament, the 8th Parliament, in 2017. That Parliament was dissolved on 30 July, on the eve of the elections in 2018. and therefore all the bills that were existing then, they lapsed. Now here's the problem. Our Constitutional Court, when it had an opportunity to declare Constitutional Amendment number 1 invalid, and it found that the process by which it had been passed was unconstitutional, but for some very strange reason, which I would love to ask the Chief Justice to explain one day in a moment of relaxation, is why they went on to declare the bill and not the act unconstitutional. But you'll understand why they did that. They did that because they wanted to create a facade, a fraud, and that would suggest that actually the bill is still there and all that is needed is to have the Senate sit again and vote on it. But of course, it's absolute nonsense because the bill no longer existed. The bill had been dissolved. So here's the problem that we have. We have a problem of a parliament which violates the Constitution by voting on something that does not exist. You have a constitutional court which violates the Constitution by giving a directive on something that is patently illegal and unconstitutional. You have an executive which pursues the same amendment, which is illegal and unconstitutional. So you have the three branches of the state, which are supposed to be protecting the Constitution, but they're the ones that are violating it. Clearly, we have a constitutional crisis. Now, here's the challenge, or a bigger challenge that we have. And Julian, and I think Brian also mentioned this earlier. When we talk about beneficiaries of these amendments, one of the biggest constituents that is benefiting from these amendments are the judges of the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court. Why? Because they're the ones whose term of office is being extended from 70 to 75 years. They're the ones who are going to probably benefit from the president appointing them without going through the process of public interviews. The whole purpose of public interviews was to enable people to have an opportunity to participate in the appointment of the judges who have authority from the people. It was also intended to promote openness and transparency in the process of appointing judges. Now, this has all been taken away. You saw the judges being interviewed last year in September. They probably were not very happy with being subjected to such public scrutiny. They probably deem it embarrassing for them. But that is precisely why those provisions were designed like that. It was that if you are fit and proper, then you must be prepared to face the public and to openly defend yourself and showcase your talents as a judge. But they probably don't like that as well. So what we have here is we have a situation where the people, namely the judges, who might be called upon to make decisions on the legality of these constitutional amendments, are also interested parties because they're the ones who are intended to benefit from these. Now, it's a major test for them, the cases that are before them. They are going to have to demonstrate that they can go beyond their self-interest and look at the Constitution for what it is, the supreme law of the land that requires their protection. But here is a problem that we have, and I want people to understand that we have the potential of a huge constitutional crisis in that the judges might declare that actually everything is okay. But actually, it's not okay, because what has happened, as we have shown today, and has been shown in other writings on this subject, is patently illegal. And so, what is the problem? The problem is that anything that takes place beyond that is going to be illegal. And so, we have a problem here where our highest court in the land is going to be based on an illegality and is going to be issuing judgments on the basis of illegalities. This is precisely the same situation that we had, mind you, after 1965, when Ian Douglas Smith declared unilateral independence from the United Kingdom, and it was declared that whatever they were doing then was illegal. And then we, of course, ended up with the Lancaster House constitutional negotiations and agreement in 1979. We are going to have a situation, in my opinion, where there's going to be a de facto constitutional court with a de facto Chief Justice who should not be in that office because of these illegalities. But at the same time, you know, this is where we now come to the people and say, what do you do when you're faced with a situation of illegality and illegitimacy, such a toxic amendment which makes everything illegal. Now, we go back to what the Constitution says. The Constitution says authority to govern derives from the people. Authority that the judges have derives from the people. Authority that the executive has, what Parliament has, derives from the people. This is very important. And I mention this because without singing for myself, it was something that I and a few others were very particular about during the constitution making process. It was deliberate to say authority derived from the people. You will not find it in the old constitution. It is there because we wanted people to understand that they are the repositories of authority. And if they don't want the way that that authority is being used, they have the liberty to withdraw it or to express their desire for its withdrawal. How do they do that? They do that using the rights that are provided for in the very constitution that we are talking about. In my opinion, what we have here is a constitutional and political crisis. It is unlikely to be resolved through litigation, through the courts of law, because they are conflicted, as I've already mentioned. The way that this can be opposed, the way that this can be stopped, is through political action. And that political action has to be organized by the people. Now, they could do so through political organizations, they could do so through civic organizations, but they definitely have the power to say Section 59 allows us the right to demonstrate. Section 61 allows us the right to express ourselves. You know, there are a number of provisions that allow people to do that. We are probably in a situation where we are unable or unwilling to use these rights for whatever reason. Yes, the state is very strong, it's very powerful, but when you have a situation such as what we have now, I don't think that you can wait for those who are benefiting from these unlawful or illegal amendments and hope that it's going to change anything. All these things, of course, are very peaceful, non-violent. I want people, Zimbabweans, my colleagues, everybody, to take a moment sometimes to look at the American civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s and understand the doctrine of peaceful, non-violent action, which was propagated and championed by people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You know, this is not about being violent in demanding your rights. This is about being peaceful in demanding and standing up for your rights and saying that we don't want this. You know, I could go on and on and on. Litigation is an option. Yes, it is there. Fair enough, people should pursue it. But I'm not sure that techies will ever sing for Christmas. And I doubt that these judges are going to stand in defense of the Constitution, even though there are clear violations of the Constitution. I would like them to surprise me. I would be pleasantly surprised if they stand up as they are required to do in defense of the Constitution. I'm not optimistic on that front. In my opinion, it all lies in the hands of the people to say, we voted for this Constitution, we want transparency, we want openness, this is being taken away, and we do not want this to be done to the Constitution. We want to avoid, we want to stop the mutilation of the Constitution. I am going to stop there. Otherwise, I could go on and on. There's so much to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alex, for that presentation. And thank you for speaking to us on the issues of the constitutional crisis that we find ourselves in, a crisis that we've had in the past. You referred to November 2017, which led to the stepping down of former President Mugabe. And you speak to us about the fundamental thread that runs through Constitutional Amendment 1 and 2, and this being the narrowing of the gap between the executive and the judiciary in fact, you say the executive has hijacked the judiciary. And I think this speaks to what also Sipho spoke to, that there has been a haste that has happened, where the judiciary has been robbed, and we see the taking away of this judiciary power. You speak to what you call constitutional infidelity, and you have also spoken to Section 328 of the Constitution, which requires 2/3 majority for passing of the bill. And as you rounded up, you reminded us that the people are the ones who have the power in a non-violent, peaceful manner to reclaim their positions. I will read comments from the virtual space. We have comments from Facebook, and we have comments also on the chat. These comments are related to your presentation and also to the presentations from the other speakers. So I'll also invite the other speakers to listen in and pick some of the comments and respond to them. The first question that I will read out is: do you think ED and his military care about the Constitution at all? They do as they wish, in my opinion. They do as they wish, in my opinion, as long as it doesn't threaten their power. And then this is 1 + 5T. Okay. Wellington, I tend to agree with Madugu when he said he was against the idea of letting politicians lead the constitution making. All that is being deleted or amended were put by politicians to fight their opponents. I suspect if the MDC Alliance was in government now, they will be amending some of those areas they were comfortable with at the time. With clear unconstitutional amendments like this, can not the Law Society of Zimbabwe get involved? Can the Law Society of Zimbabwe get involved as custodians of the profession? It is obvious the profession of lawyers is being harmed and degraded. What is the rationale behind the retirement age of judges being higher than that of all other formal workers? And then another comment is from Facebook. Why is it that we have not seen a diaspora group of lawyers coming together to try and reinforce the lawyers at home for a stronger voice of the citizens? And then there's another response that the Law Society is not effective when it comes to challenging the government. Mr. Alex say this can be resolved politically. How politically? When demonstrations are banned, elected officials can be recalled using the same courts. What kind of political action can be used? Thanks for the excellent presentation, Alex. The call for building a non-violent civil resistance movement is well taken. And then in light of all that the contributors have shared concerning constitutional assault by the executive arm of the government, how about the assault that comes via the statutory instruments? And then another contribution from Facebook: what can citizens do in light of the situation where Parliament decides to change the Constitution to suit individuals, in this case, the president's interest? And there is no political party that can stop the ZANU train. It's time people stand and address this monster. And then what can we as youth help to challenge this bill? Yeah. So those are some of the comments that we have from Facebook and from our chat. I will give the opportunity to Dr. Alex to respond, and then I will then go to Nigiwe and then to Julian before I give Brian and Sipho. You can come back, Dr.
Okay.
Alex. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Belinda. One of the questions was, do I think that Mr. Mnangagwa and Mr. Chiwenga and others, do they care for the Constitution? Well, I think if you look at it from a very superficial perspective, you might think, oh, they don't care about it, but actually they do. You know, if they didn't, they wouldn't be amending the constitution. All leaders in this world, whether they are democratic or authoritarian dictators, they always want a veneer of legitimacy. They always want a stamp of legitimacy. So the Constitution provides that sort of veneer of legality, that what they are doing is legal. Even vile dictators in history like Hitler, Stalin, they all had constitutions of sorts. And we have seen this in many other parts of the world. And we have the same. They do care about the Constitution, but only to the extent that it allows them the instrument of control, that it gives them power. That's why, as Brian said, it's a reconstitution, it's a reconfiguration of the state in order to enhance and to provide that power, but to do so with a veneer of legitimacy, a facade that things are being done in accordance with the law. So yeah, they do care about it. And we, you and I, should also care about it, to say that, no, you cannot do that. Number two, someone mentioned the issue about, people-driven constitution, or maybe we should not have had the constitution. I mean, with all due respect, that's rhetoric. I want someone to tell me a constitution in this world that has been written by some so-called non-interested people, angels who have sat down and said, we are writing a constitution and we have nothing to do with it. Constitutions are always written by political actors, whether they are politicians or they are civic actors, wherever they are, intellectuals, they have a part in writing the constitution. The process of writing it itself is not something that you leave to the ordinary person and say, yeah, you can do. We had some interesting observations during the constitution making process. Some people, for example, said, yeah, we should have torture. People should be tortured so that they give evidence. Now, you can't have a constitution that allows torture. It's against international law. So, we have to be a little bit more nuanced when we talk about these issues of who writes a constitution and how it's done. At the end of the day, a document was produced. It is not perfect. There are weaknesses. There are a lot of things in there that I don't like. But you know what? That is what is there. And if you look at even the so-called great constitutions of the world, they are very small, thin documents which are, which give a lot of power to the president actually, and to other actors. But they've got norms, they've got unwritten rules that have been perfected over the years, which they use in order to run their countries. If people could do a comparative analysis of constitutions, I think that they would have a very different view on this issue of, who writes the constitution? Is it the politician or the other? You are not going to write a constitution that you are going to confer and say to those in politics, okay, take it or leave it. You don't have the power to do so. So you work with what is there and you try and come up with the best. Regarding lawyers in the diaspora, well, I suppose, forming groups is great. I'm in the diaspora. Every day, every week, I am trying to do something that I can do in order to shape discourse, in order to, deconstruct judgments, to challenge laws. I do so from here. I don't have anybody who says to me, Alex, you must do so, or here's an incentive for you to do so. I always say people should do what they can do. They don't have to wait and say, what can I do? I always get this question from people. What can I do? We have to be creative in what we can do. Let's do our best in our individual spaces, either individually or as groups. Someone asked me, what can we do when demonstrations are banned? Again, interesting question, but I also get frustrated by this because it also means that we don't read our history. If we read our history, even our own history of liberation from colonialism, you would understand that there were phases that people went through, from the trade unions in the 1930s, 1940s, people trying to organize themselves to try and challenge the structures. They were very limited in what they were trying to achieve. And then it graduated in the 1950s. And then it graduated in the 1960s when they realized that political action that they were taking was not working. And they moved on to another level. the point I'm making is that you don't say we are banned, therefore what do? You know, we are not the first people, we are not the first generation to face that challenge. There are generations before us in our own country and in other parts of the world where they have been banned from doing things, but you know, that did not stop them from organizing in order to achieve their right. So we need to expand our thinking, expand our reading, expand our understanding of history and how we confront the challenges that come. I think that I'm going to leave that for now and let the others come in with their contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. We can do something in our own space, either individually or collectively. Each person has a role to play. I will ask Nigi to come and respond. Thereafter, I will ask Julian. Thank you.
Thank you, Belinda. I will not add much. I'm sure Alex has covered most of the issues that have been raised in this platform. What we have seen is that there's no political will to actually uphold the rule of law, and even organized protests. I'm sure we have seen previously that there is enough resources to actually deal with all of us here in that manner. So what we would encourage really is peaceful means to solve conflict. In as much as we're not going to attain much in terms of litigation and all, it is indeed a constitutional crisis situation that we are in. And we are hoping to come together, form teams, all the like-minded people who are concerned about this situation. We all have work to do, really. We can't only leave that to the Lawyers Society of Zimbabwe or the lawyers in the diaspora, in as much as it can work with the lawyers in the diaspora, because the level of exposure that they have and what we have here in the country, it's actually different. Maybe it can work, but surely it should be teamwork. Everyone concerned has got work to do. Organized solutions are the way forward. We continue to engage the state actors to say, but why are we doing this? And see how far we can go, because litigation really, I don't see it attaining much of the results that are intended in this manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigi, and also for continuing to emphasize on the need for organized solutions. Margaret Mead says, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And so we are moving from small groups of these thoughtful, committed citizens, and we are widening the net and continuing to increase and motivate each other. Julian, I would like to invite you to come and respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Belinda, and thank you, Nigiwe, and thank you, Alex. Very enlightening presentations that the last two speakers shared. Alex, I want to encourage you to say, you did say that you're not optimistic about litigation, but I would encourage you to say litigation sometimes brings us the answers that we seek. And this speaks to the questions that were also on the group. I remember Temba put in a question, Kululi put in a question, Pumla also put in a question to that effect, on what do we do and how can we challenge this? And as a litigator, I believe in strategic litigation. I believe that if we continue to knock on the doors of the court, at some point they will open their doors. There's been a lot of constitutional challenges that have been placed before the courts, and sometimes decisions take a long time. Sometimes litigation seems expensive and quite tiring, but I believe at some point we'll realize the results. And I would say to Temba, who raised a question concerning time limits, that yes, there are time limits that are provided for in the constitutional provisions. In this case, particularly when he spoke of the issue of the judiciary. What we need to do is to be vigilant and to know our law, what the Constitution says, what the proposed amendments are, what the implications are, what it means for you and I as a citizen of Zimbabwe, as a Zimbabwean. And once we know where there has been digression from the Constitution, then certainly we should be able to knock on the doors of the courts. Yes, they're the very persons that are benefiting from the proposed amendments. But at the end of the day, I do believe that they have a role to uphold and justice should be done. At some point, it should be done. And if it's not done, I believe that as the people will still be able to come up with ways in respect of which to ensure that the people's voice is heard. And Alex spoke to it at some length, which I believe can definitely be taken up by the people of Zimbabwe. And another question that came up was, what can people do to prevent the people's voices from being ignored? And once again, I would come back to the answer of litigation, and to be able to bring in supporting evidence to buttress any such applications where you're challenging the constitutionality or otherwise of any proposed amendments. I believe Belinda came up with a question towards just after my presentation, where she asked who the MPs represent. And I will say the MPs represent us, the people. And when we vote people to represent us in the legislature, we should be able to hold them to account. So we should not be afraid as citizens to hold those that we have voted into power to account, including the executive itself. So we should be able to bring them to account. And we have the law to protect us. Like Alex said, and you put it very well to say that the executive is concerned about the Constitution, because if they were not, certainly they wouldn't be seeking to amend it. So much as they are concerned about the Constitution, as the people, we should also be concerned about the Constitution, what it says, and how we can invoke its provisions to protect our interests, because the Constitution is derived from the people, and the people's voice should prevail. That will be my contribution, Belinda.
Thank you, Gillian, and thank you for emphasizing on the voice of the citizens, that we must prevail as citizens. And the question is, how do we prevail? There is a question related to that, where, let me just bring it up. The question to the panelists and the participants is, can we safely conclude that the taxpayers and resources were wasted when public consultations were done, given that the majority of those consulted were totally against these amendments? So why did we do the public consultations? Why do we even do the public hearings if what the people say does not matter at the end of the day, if this can be disregarded? And then there is another question. At Julian, we have seen protests, demonstrations by individuals being shut down and the individuals arrested. Why don't you as litigators strike at the heart of the law that is being used to shut down these protests instead of getting the arrested out of jail only? And then another question is, we don't have time to wait for a compromised judiciary to open the doors at some point. So it takes 41 more. So if it takes 41 more years, we should wait and just continue litigating issues. That is hard. And then my question to independent media houses like the one here, ZFM Radio, what is their role in educating the population about the Constitution, voter education, registration, and other issues pertaining to the running of government? And then we have a question that says, is President Mnangagwa and VP Chiwenga in agreement on the constitutional amendment? If not, how can the masses widen the gap between the two? And then a combined effort of nonviolent strategy and litigation is needed. Both are important at this time. And then to all speakers, is there a role for the international community? Many European donors funded the COPAC process. Is there anything that they can do or should do? And then can we say that the 2013 constitution was 100% perfect and therefore should not be tampered with? And to Alex, why wasn't a referendum made prerequisite to amend any part of the constitution? And from Facebook again, I agree the courts should be the first step. We should also challenge our MPs and hold them accountable for agreeing to these amendments, regardless of public opinion against them. And then lastly, peaceful demonstrations sounds as the best option, but previously we have seen hired thugs hijacking these demonstrations, providing reasons for police to arrest those demonstrating peacefully. I will give this opportunity to Sipho. There are questions that have been addressed to all speakers, and I'll ask him to respond, and then I'll ask Brian to speak. Thank you.
I'm trying to look for questions that were directed at me.
There are questions that were directed to all speakers. Let me just remind you.
Maybe remind me, yes, thank you.
For the international community, many European donors funded the COPAC process. Is there anything they can or should do? And can we say the 2013 constitution is 100% perfect and should not be tampered with? Then I'll remind you of others. You can go ahead. Thank you.
Yes. So I get the point, or the question on the COPAC. And I actually, by some fortune, I happened to have been at UNDP at the time the constitution was designed, and as part of UNDP support, helped design the support to the COPAC process. And I recall that the way it was designed was to support a hugely consultative process, and a lot of money ended up going to travel, to allowances, to going to villages, and so on. So I'm very familiar with the design of the constitutional support program. Now, we are not there anymore. Here we are defending the constitution. We are at a place where the constitution must be defended. And we do not need donor money to do that. We do not need COPAC. We do not need UNDP. We do not need the EU. We need the people to stand up and defend their constitution. It doesn't even require a cent. Many countries, I highlighted to you about 10 different revolutions that have come up because of authoritarianism. I didn't add another 15 or 20. There is over 35, 40, 50 revolutions in the past 10 years that have happened. And I want to remind people another thing, which is the AU recognizes the power of the people over their leaders. That is precisely why whenever there have been people-powered revolutions and uprisings against authoritarianism and violations of the constitution by leaders, the AU takes the side of the people. That's why the AU had no problem with removing Mugabe, because it was presented as a people revolution against Mugabe. The AU had no problem with removing Blaise Compaoré because it was presented as a people-powered revolution. They had no problem with removing Bashir. It was presented in the same way. They had no problem with removing Mubarak. I'm saying, and I'm saying this clearly and unequivocally, there is no point in waiting for anybody. These constitutional changes, as Brian pointed out, are far-reaching. They're going to change everything. It's a few people that are concentrating all the power, and they're going to use this power, as we have already seen, to accumulate wealth, to steal the money, to rule over us, to oppress to bludgeon and to beat and to torture. Only the people can stop this. Yes, they'll send the military, but Sudanese military was 10 times stronger than the Zimbabwean military. Blaise Compaore's military was helping and supporting, providing peace operations in the whole of West Africa. It was even stronger than the Zimbabwean military. All these militaries have been strong, but the people, there is no army that is stronger than the people. At the end of the day, the people are going to have to make a decision. And it's not up to me to make them do that. It's not up to anybody to make them do that. We can only point out the existential threats that are presented by the actions of this small elite that is interested in increasing its power and authority and lining its pockets, using our resources and butchering and manipulating documents, supreme constitutional edicts we have agreed on. If we don't defend them, I can assure you, if we don't defend them, we have ourselves to blame. The Congolese refused when Kabila tried to change the constitution. And Kabila failed because the Congolese went out there, he shot people, he killed people, he did all these things. But where is Kabila now? He's gone because the people made a decision that they were not going to accept. They knew every time they go out there, Kabila is going to kill them. He killed so many young people on the streets. And the Congolese did not need the EU. They didn't need a COPAC. They didn't need anybody. They decided that we are not going to go back there. Mind you, we're talking about Congolese who had endured Mobutu Sese Seko for 30, 40 years. They said, we're not accepting that nonsense. We endured Mugabe for 40 years, 37 years precisely. Why the hell are we accepting this nonsense? We must just refuse. It's not just for us. I mean, it's for our children. Some of us are already in our 50s. It may not matter. We can live in many different countries. But we cannot accept this. I personally cannot accept it. But who am I, ultimately? Thank you.
Thank you, Sipho. You are one thoughtful citizen who needs to work with other thoughtful citizens, and we make the change. So thank you for challenging us that we as the citizens need to stand up against authoritarianism, against this consolidation of power, and defend the constitution and defend the country against the few who want to continue plundering it. And thank you also for reminding us about the AU and how the AU respects people power. So thank you for that. Brian, may I invite you?
Yeah, I think that the takeaway from this brilliant meeting, and thank you to brilliant presentations, is that this is not a feud over the mutilation of a document endorsed by citizens in 2018. But this is a consciousness about the mutilation of national values, national vision, and political culture that we thought we had agreed to in 2018, as imperfect as that might have been. It's important for us to remember this is not about reshaping law in the present. So even if they reversed the intended amendments and Mnangagwa refused to sign them, he woke up with an epiphany and said, I will not sign this because this is the reversal of the people's mandate. What this is about is defining the right of the people of Zimbabwe to hold government, all authority, and all power to account, and not vice versa. And therefore, if we are analyzing this, and I would urge lawyers, brilliant political scientists, that it is possible to analyze the document, commitments and failures that are looking at text. But it is useful for us to take a political economy lens that looks at what is the long-term agenda of the elite, number one. And that agenda extends beyond the eldership, their clansmen, and their children. That agenda of consolidation goes beyond the current office holders. right? And it is important in thinking in that vein for us to then say, if we're dealing with a long-term project where primitive accumulation, where criminalization of dissent, or the manufacture of a society of silence, right? What do we do? Because it is not just about stopping the current madness. It is actually creating a new culture. It's not just about saying enough is enough. It's actually saying we need to move in a different direction. And it seems to me that it is important to combine these strategies and not assume that all elites in
Brian, I think there's something wrong with your sound. It's coming out faintly.
I don't know what to do now. Should I? You can't hear me at all?
It's very faint.
Okay, let's use traditional means. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, it's better, but still very faint.
Madam, okay, why don't you get someone else to speak? Let me try and rejoin the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We'll do that. Okay. Thank you. I'll request that my host be on the lookout for Brian rejoining the meeting. Let me quickly read some of the comments that have come in. I'm going to ask our guests just to give us some parting shots after these questions that I will read. The provisions at Dr. Makaisa says the amendments we are discussing, are they unique to Zimbabwe, or there are similar such provisions in the constitutions of our nations considered to be advanced democracies or advancing democracies? And then the response from Dr. Alex is the provision that protects the term limits. Okay, there was a question on the term limits. The provision that protects the term limits against incumbents benefiting from it is protected by the need for a referendum. That's why I said Section 328 not only protects the Constitution, but it also protects itself. So this disguised amendment by amendment number 2 is unconstitutional. It responds to a question that was also asked on Facebook, whether Chief Justice, who is supposed to retire in the next 2 weeks, will be a beneficiary of this amendment. So we wait to see if that's going to happen. And then the statement that there is no political will to uphold the Constitution, is it not a perception or opinion which obviously will be made by those who will be predominantly opposition? Okay. If only the people could be mobilized against this machinery and refuse this rubbish. I will ask now, I will give Dr. Alex a minute to give us a response to some of the things in these parting words. Then I will go to Nihiwe and then Julian, and then finally go back to Sipho and Brian to give us their parting shots. Thank you. Dr. Alex, may I invite you to give us your parting words? And
okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll try to squeeze them in. Now, are the provisions unique to Zimbabwe? In fact, what happened with the 2013 constitution is that we really used the model that was already in the South African constitution and also in the Kenyan constitution concerning the appointment of judges. And it was meant to promote openness and transparency. And unfortunately, both countries have done very well, I think, so far in using those processes. And we were doing very well, I think, in the last 7 years until, of course, the changes that are now being introduced. And that's why I think that these changes are retrogressive. I wanted to answer the question about whether the 2013 Constitution is perfect and cannot be touched. In fact, that was going to be my preamble to my talk, which would have been that, look, a constitution is not set in stone. It's not an immutable document. It can be changed. But those changes have to be necessary and democratic. The point mentioned by my co-panelist about strategic litigation, oh, absolutely, I agree with you, Julian. I am always encouraging lawyers to litigate. I'm sure when you read my articles, I'm always suggesting what can be done, the litigation that can be done. But I always do that with the qualification that litigation on its own is not enough because it depends. And in particular, in this case, it depends on actors who are interested in these amendments. And that's why I'm sort of less optimistic about the chances, but I would love to be surprised. My parting shot, chairperson, is that I would like people to go away appreciating and understanding what a constitutional crisis is, and that we are currently in a constitutional crisis because of these amendments that are both illegal and illegitimate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alex. Thank you for that. We are in a constitutional crisis, and to take us out of it is you and I and every citizen. Thank you. May I invite Nigiwe?
Thank you, Belinda. To the government of Zimbabwe, I would say, in terms of our constitution, transparency and accountability is not too much to ask for, especially from our civil servants. And to our fellow citizens, I would say, in the midst of a crisis, let's remain level-headed and peaceful and use whatever means or available and the resources available to us to actually solve this crisis. All the best to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigi. A strong word, hands off our constitution, and let's remain peaceful, vigilant, but peaceful. Thank you. Julian?
Thank you very much, Belinda. As Zimbabweans, we're very familiar with the statement that we heard in 2007, which says, Iwe neni tinebasa. So there is the potential to be apathetic regarding challenging unconstitutional aspects, but I would encourage that each and every one of us should play our part as Zimbabweans. We should use our strengths, because I believe each and every person has one strength. So some, it would be through litigation, use that strength. Some will be through peaceful demonstrations, use that strength. But whichever way, we each have a voice, and we're each able to make a difference, whether in our small strides or in our wide strides. But I believe that this is not the time to be apathetic, but to be actively involved in safeguarding our institutions and safeguarding our constitution as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you. We each have our different strengths, and we must use them to scaffold each other's efforts. Thank you for that. I'm going to invite Sipho.
Well, I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this dialogue, and to thank my fellow panelists for their insightful inputs. And of course, to thank all the participants and all the questions and the contributions they've made. I think I've said everything I needed to say about this, and I just wish to God that we can put an end to this nonsense, because it is really nonsense. Thank you.
Thank you, Sipho. Yes, we will put an end to the nonsense as we work together. May I invite Brian? I think he is back.
Can you hear me?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay. So just three quick takeaways. This is not just about reshaping law in the present. This is about redefining the right of the people to hold government, all authority and all power to account. But also this is about the long-term agenda, not just of those who are currently in power, the eldership and their clansmen and their families or children. This is a long-term agenda of a particular class. So those classes of poor people, those classes of young people, of women, those who are on the margins of the nation that have been excluded from the gravy train from 1980 up to now. Those sons and daughters of workers and workers themselves in the informal sector, vendors, cross-border traders, for whom this tinkering with the Constitution makes no sense and will bring no benefit. It is about time we begin to say, is Zimbabwe for all of us or just a few? Right? And that is a fundamental question. That's why it must be litigated in court, outside of court, but we must have these dialogues and multilogues in churches, in political parties, on the streets, in beer halls, everywhere where we can have this conversation. What does it mean to be a Zimbabwean? Do we want to live together as one people? If so, on what terms? What sort of institutions and what sort of leadership? Those are the questions we thought we had answered in 2013. They are being unmade by a small clique. And a small clique whose legitimacy is always impugned. And it is important at this juncture that we not be simplistic about what will it take and how long will it take. And I think what you've heard from every speaker is that all hands on deck. One thing I must caution us against is an constant default to external forces or donor class in order to mediate or litigate or resolve our national condition. They have their own problems in America. You saw with the invasion of capital. But they invested years in building institutions. The only thing that will save us is if we draw certain red lines. Certain institutions matter and they must remain non-partisan. The civil service or the public administration is one of those. Everyone's child, no matter their ethnic group, no matter the region they come from, no matter their class, no matter their political affiliation, should be able to access and enjoy benefits from the public administration without the sort of command and control that we see now. A political party card and affiliation should not be the basis. If you had no other reason to fight this amendment, it is to fight how law is being used to institutionalize the supremacy, not only over law and institutions, but over society of very narrow cliquism and political interests.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you that you're able to resolve the technological challenge and give us this final parting shot. So what does it mean to be a Zimbabwean and on what terms? And this is the fight that we are braving up for, to defend the Constitution, because we defined those terms and a few people cannot be allowed to change the terms of engagement for Zimbabweans. And so with that, let me invite Dr. Gordon Moyo to give us the closing remarks on behalf of the organizers. And while he's coming on, let me thank the panelists. Thank you, our guests. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Sipho. Thank you, Dr. Alex. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Nigiwe. And thank you for giving us that, taking your time and giving us this insight into what is going on at this point. Thank you, Sipho. And you have really enlightened us and motivated us even more. That as we leave this meeting, we must sit one with another and say, what can I do to save Zimbabwe? What can I do to protect the Constitution? So thank you with that. Let me invite Dr. Gordon Moyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With your indulgence, allow me to speak off camera. I have a very weak network. You have already done the work for me to thank our panelists. I think our audience will agree with me that they were thoroughly informed this afternoon, thoroughly inspired, thoroughly motivated, and thoroughly angered by our presenters. By angered, I mean made angry to move forward. And I would like to thank you. These are able debaters, erudite scholars and thinkers who took their time with us this afternoon. It is now up to all of us, Zimbabweans, civic society organizations, academics, democracy campaigners and democracy promoters to do something. I think when Brian started, by the way, Brian was an athlete. I don't know whether he's still an athlete. He used to start a relay. When he started the relay, really with the political analysis, and he gave that baton to Sipho, who was very passionate and very angry, and gave that to Nigiwe with the analysis, and gave it to the lady, not to Nigiwe, but it was Julian, then to Nigiwe with their simplicity, and finally with Magaisa giving us the way forward. We are grateful. For me, the parting word is what Brian and all of them said. We have a situation where there is a re-centralization of power. That's the take home for me. Re-centralization of power, restructuring of our state, the attitude of the state, the behavior of the state is going to last long if we do not do what Sipho said, build the movement, a non-resistant movement to deal with it. Because our government is molding itself along the lines of Beijing model, the Chinese model of governance, the Chinese model of economic development. We all know that the Chinese are all over Zimbabwe, all over Africa. In Zimbabwe, their footprint is in all the sectors of our economy, in the public service, in the extractive industries, everywhere. We now know that the Politburo, as Brian rightly said it, the Politburo, like the Politburo in China, is the one that is detecting the pace. It is not the cabinet colleagues. It is the Politburo, the G7 of the Politburo, that is determining the pace. Cabinet is a rubber stamping institution of the Politburo. So is the parliament. So we have a situation where the electorate, a few individuals are running this country. And if we do not do something, we will be in sixes and sevens, and our generations and our children will spit on our graves. Otherwise, thank you very much for inspiring, for instructing us, and for informing us. On behalf of Wild, on behalf of Side, on behalf of Breeze, we are grateful. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Moyo. Let me thank the participants across the virtual space, on Facebook, here on Zoom. You have been awesome. You have participated with your comments and you've sat through this meeting. And we are excited about what is the potential for the country as we go out of this place. So thank you for that. Have a pleasant evening, and do not forget to take your space. It is up to you, and it is up to I to be angry enough. I see Sipho is sorry for being angry. It's contagious, so I'm also angry now. It is up to you and I to take all our positions and defend our constitution and defend our country. So thank you for that. Stay safe and be blessed. Thank you.